The word of the cross is the power of God. The word of the cross is the power of God. I want to try to explain this mysterious phrase by referring to the concept of a paradox. The baby in Bethlehem was a paradox. The eternal God had become a baby. The Most High God had become a baby. Somebody said infinity contracted to a span. God incomprehensibly made man. The baby in the manger was a paradox. But a deeper, more astounding, more mysterious paradox is the cross of Christ. How could the cross, which is the ultimate in human impotency, be a revelation from the Most High God? How could the cross be a word from the God of heaven and earth? And how could the word of the cross be the power of God? Whenever God chooses to reveal himself to humanity, it always involves a paradox, because it involves the infinite speaking to the finite. What does God say in Isaiah 40? To whom will you compare me? Who is my equal? What image is appropriate for you to liken me to? Do you not know? Have you not heard? Have you not understood from the beginning? The Lord sits enthroned above the circle of the earth, and all these people and all its people are like grasshoppers. He stretches out the heavens like a canopy, like a tent to live in. There's an infinite chasm between the I am, the self-existent one, and the creature. He is eternal. We are borne along in the winds of time. He is infinite. We are bounded on all sides. He is the only sovereign God of heaven and earth, and from him and through him and to him are all things. Whenever God chooses to reveal himself to man, he does astounding works that are completely impossible for man. He reveals himself in creation by calling things into being which are not. He reveals himself even more gloriously in redemption, for he calls light out of darkness. He didn't just ignore the darkness and set up a new thing. He calls light out of the darkness. He calls righteousness out of unrighteousness. He calls the glory of the eternal day out of the dark night of sin. He quickens the dead. He makes the dead alive. And lest humanity become tempted to glory in our goodness and our power and our wisdom, because that would prevent God from revealing himself, he deliberately makes our power and wisdom and righteousness and goodness into nothing by deliberately choosing the weak and the foolish things of this world to reveal himself. And there's nothing more weak and foolish than the cross of Christ. The cross is a word from God. I'm not talking about preaching about the cross. I'm trying to preach about the cross this morning. I'm not talking about that. When I said that the cross is a word from God, the NIV says the message of the cross. But in Greek it's the word of the cross. Ho logos to staro, the word of the cross. So I'm not just speaking about preaching about the cross. When I say the word of the cross, I'm talking about God speaking through the cross. In a way, all things, anything, might be said to be a word from God. Because in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and by the word of the Lord, by the word of God were all things made. And apart from the word of God, nothing has been made nothing was made that has been made. There's a word from God in the golden glory of the sun. God speaks through the silvery shimmer of the moon reflected in the mountain lake. There's a word from God in the gentle lamb and the roaring lion. God speaks through the lightning and the thunder. There's a word from God in the murmuring brook and the tempestuous ocean. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows forth his handiwork. The word of God is the meaning of any particular thing. It's the meaning on the essence of any and everything. Philosophers are always trying to talk about the meaning of things and the essence of things, but the real meaning of anything, any particular thing, is the Word of God. Because the Word of God spoke it into being. And the cross is a word from God. I was going to say, let's imagine ourselves back 2,000 years on the hill of Calvary and listen to what God is saying. But we don't need to imagine ourselves back in time, back on the hill of Calvary, because God has been speaking through the cross for the last 2,000 years, 24/7, incessantly. So we don't need to imagine ourselves back in time. Let's listen to what God is saying now through the cross. And we hear. We just be silent and we hear. And we hear his righteousness. We hear his holiness. We hear his terrible displeasure against sin. We don't hear the petty judgment of man. We are oblivious to the judgment of Pilate. We are oblivious to the judgment of the Sanhedrin. We are oblivious to the taunting and the mocking and the scoffing of the wicked crowd around Jesus. We only hear the voice of God, and we are struck by the awful thunder of God's wrath. A thunder of his wrath that's brings dread and terror into our hearts of death and hell. We understand that every drop seeping from the hands and the feet and the brow of Jesus is laden with the wrath of God against sin. And we see the darkness spreads its awful wings over Calvary, and we understand that God is turning his face away from us, and he's coming to judge the world. And we want to cry out to the mountains to fall on us and hide us from the wrath of the one who sits upon the throne, because we understand that it's not his sin, Jesus' sin, but our sin that's provoking God, the awful wrath of God. All our power, all our goodness, all our wisdom has come to naught. But wait, don't flee. Don't flee from the hill of Calvary just yet. Let us continue to listen. Don't cease to hear the voice of God, because at the very instant then we realize that all our power, all our goodness won't save us. At that very instant we realize that what is impossible for man is possible with God. And the cross of Christ proclaims the death of Jesus of Nazareth, the Son of God, who came down to take our place in judgment, so that we might never more be condemned. And we hear the fathomless, depthless love of God for his people. This is the word of the cross, and we behold the God of our salvation. This is the mystery, this is the paradox of the cross. The offended God comes down in the flesh and bears the sin that offended him. God forsakes God. My God, why have you forsaken me? The God of God, light of light, the only Son of God, the Son of God who was in the bosom of his Father for all eternity, came down and freely took the wrath of God on him, so that we might be going free, and so that we might be righteous and never more condemned. This is the word of the cross. And we hear his fathomless, depthless love of his people, because the Son of God has obtained for us everlasting righteousness, and he's rescued us from woe, and he leads us into the presence of God and glory. This is the word of the cross. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him will not perish, but have an everlasting life. This is the word of the cross. But the word of the cross is the power of God. God doesn't just speak of righteousness, judgment, love, salvation. He accomplishes it. If you really hear God speaking through the cross, the burden of your sin is rolled away. The shackles of your chains of bondage are broken. Death has lost its sting. Righteousness, everlasting holiness and righteousness and life and joy and hope are bestowed upon you. Have you heard the word of the cross?